When I first stepped into the offices of Dornan Industries, the air was thick with failure. The walls seemed to echo with the weight of poor decisions, and the few employees who hadn't already jumped ship looked at me with a kind of dead-eyed resignation that made it clear they were only sticking around for their final paycheck. The company, once a moderately respected regional manufacturer of industrial parts, was bleeding money from every corner. My father-in-law, Howard, had tried to put on a brave face at the wedding, but I could already see the panic behind his eyes. 2 weeks later, he handed me the keys to his legacy, muttering something about fresh eyes and young blood as he walked away from the business he'd driven straight into the ground. I didn't take the offer out of love or obligation. I took it because I saw an opportunity. I was 41, with years of industrial strategy experience under my belt, and I knew this was the kind of challenge that could either make or break me. The company was valued at $13 million, but it was a shell of itself. Outdated machinery, bloated departments, zero digital infrastructure, and a sales pipeline drier than Nevada asphalt. I wasn't stepping into a role. I was stepping into a disaster zone with a fire hose in one hand and a scalpel in the other. The first year was pure hell. I spent 16-hour days in that crumbling office building, dissecting every division. I terminated redundant managers who'd spent the last 5 years collecting paychecks without contributing a dime of value. I cut vendor contracts that were clearly kickbacks from old friends of Howard's. I liquidated assets no one even remembered we owned. Then I rebuilt department by department. I brought in agile thinkers, data analysts, engineers with fresh certifications. I introduced a cloud-based logistics system that, at the time, most of the staff didn't even understand. I sat in on cold calls. I renegotiated shipping contracts. I visited warehouses at 3 a.m. just to see who was coasting and who was committed. I didn't take a real vacation for nearly a decade. Meanwhile, Whitney, the woman I married because I genuinely loved her, settled effortlessly into the role of a business mogul's wife. She hosted brunches and galas at our Lakeview mansion, a place we bought once I got the company back to profitability. She posted our curated lives online, sipping rose beside infinity pools while I was on factory floors dealing with mechanical breakdowns and union negotiations. She told her friends I was a genius, a visionary, and I suppose that's the image I let her sell. I didn't care much for appearances. I cared about results, and the numbers didn't lie. By year 5, we'd cleared our debt. By year 8, we were expanding, new product lines, international clients, custom manufacturing solutions that made competitors scramble to keep up. I built partnerships with aerospace contractors, energy firms, and even a defense supplier. By year 10, Dorrington wasn't just surviving, it was thriving, with a valuation climbing north of $85 million. My name was finally being mentioned in the same breath as industry leaders I used to study in grad school. And yet, despite everything I poured into that company, my time, my health, my youth, there were moments I come home to find Whitney complaining about the caterers being late or the wrong floor arrangements for a charity benefit, as if the world might collapse over tulips instead of roses. Still, I let it go. I let a lot go, because in my mind, I wasn't doing this just for me. I was building something lasting, something solid, something no one could take away. Or so I thought. Our marriage looked flawless from the outside. People saw the mansion, the luxury cars, the black tie events, the carefully posed holiday photos, and they assumed we were the perfect couple. In a way, I did too. I wanted to believe that everything I was building had a solid foundation, that Whitney was proud of what I was doing, that we were partners in all of it. I didn't see the cracks, not at first. I was too buried in growth projections, facility upgrades, and quarterly earnings reports to realize I was living with a stranger. Whitney had mastered the role of the supportive wife. She knew when to smile at the right people, when to nod as I spoke about logistics systems or margin recovery strategies. At fundraisers, she'd squeeze my hand and lean her head against my shoulder, all for the benefit of onlookers and photographers. She wore my success like a designer dress, tailored, admired, and ultimately disposable. While I was sleeping in conference rooms between back-to-back strategy meetings, she was working late at her charity office or flying out for foundation-related travel that somehow never resulted in any documented outcomes. I ignored the early signs because acknowledging them would have shattered the image I was so desperately trying to protect. There was a sudden spike in gym visits, the boutique spa appointments she never used to care about, the upgraded lingerie tags I found while sorting the laundry one rare Saturday when I was home before noon. She was always texting, always smiling at her screen during dinners, her phone flipped face down when I'd walk into a room. I chalked it up to her social circles endless planning committees, and the influencers she was trying to recruit for some gala or charity event. I told myself she was just busy in her own way, just like I was. The cologne was different, though subtle, not mine. I noticed it once when she came home late. Said she'd had dinner with some donors. I stood in the kitchen making a protein shake at 11 p.m., and as she brushed past me, it hit me. Not the faint scent of her usual perfume, but something masculine, sharp, unfamiliar. I stared at her back as she climbed the stairs, trying to convince myself it came from a restaurant booth or a passing hug. I didn't ask. I didn't want to hear the answer. The distance between us wasn't loud. It was quiet, like fog filling a room slowly until you couldn't see the corners anymore. We'd have entire evenings where the only words spoken were logistical. Who was attending what event, what time the cleaners were coming, where the guest list was for some silent auction. The warmth we used to share, the casual intimacy, the inside jokes, it had all dried up, replaced by formalities and cold routines. When I'd finally lie down at night, bone-tired from another 16-hour day, she'd already be asleep, her back turned, or worse, out, meeting with a planner, visiting her mother, or stuck in traffic from whatever she claimed to be doing. Still, I told myself this was temporary, a phase, that I was working this hard for both of us, for the future. I believed that when the expansion stabilized, when I could finally breathe, we'd reconnect, travel, maybe even talk about kids like we used to. But the truth was, I'd already lost her. Maybe I never really had her. I had blind faith in the marriage, in the woman I thought I knew, in the family I had married into. That blind faith was my greatest weakness. Because I believed so fully in the life we had created, I didn't see that I was the only one still trying to hold it together. Whitney had long since moved on, emotionally, physically, maybe even before I ever said, I do. And I didn't see it until it was far too late. About 6 months before everything fell apart, Whitney started name-dropping someone I had never heard of before, Tyler Monroe. She'd bring him up casually at first, in that way people do when they're planting seeds, but don't want it to seem deliberate. Oh, Tyler says industrials are a sleeping giant, she mentioned over dinner. Or, Tyler thinks we're sitting on an undervalued brand, with a slight lift in her voice like it was supposed to impress me. She described him as an old college friend, a venture capitalist who'd made a name for himself flipping distressed companies and taking them public. I barely listened. I was neck-deep in negotiations with an aerospace supplier, juggling production delays and a hiring freeze. Tyler, to me, was just another name in Whitney's ever-expanding social circle of hedge fund wives and West Coast wealth. But then he started showing up, first at a charity auction, then a couple family dinners. He had the kind of presence that made people lean in when he spoke. Tall, perfect teeth, tailored suits that probably cost more than my first car. He shook hands like a politician and complimented my leadership every chance he got, always with that tone that managed to sound both admiring and condescending. You've really done something special with Dorrington, he told me once, sipping neat whiskey in our living room. It's rare to see someone turn a sinking ship into a growth engine. Now it's just about unlocking the next level. I didn't like him. He had that slick confidence, the kind that doesn't come from experience, but from knowing you can manipulate a room with charm alone. I kept my suspicions to myself, even when I noticed how easily he seemed to slide into conversations with Charles, my father-in-law. They started taking calls together, sitting side by side at events. I'd find them huddled in corners during conferences, speaking in low voices, and when I approached, the topic would shift abruptly, as if I'd walked in on something I wasn't meant to hear. Whitney brushed it off. You're being paranoid, she said when I mentioned it. Tyler's just trying to help. He believes in what you built. Then came the moment I won't ever forget. I walked into our executive boardroom on a Thursday morning, early as always. My laptop was under my arm, coffee still steaming in my hand. But as I stepped to the door, I saw him, Tyler, already seated at the head of the table. My chair, my seat. He didn't flinch. He smiled at me like it was the most natural thing in the world, and gestured to the spot next to him like I was some guest at a table I used to own. Before I could say anything, Charles walked in, his tone bright and rehearsed. Brandon, perfect timing. You know Tyler, of course. He's joining us as a strategic advisor. We've been talking, and well, you've taken us far, son, but Tyler's going to take us public. It landed like a slap. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, but Charles was serious. Too serious. My mouth went dry. I looked around the room, expecting at least a flicker of discomfort from the other board members, but I saw nothing but polite silence, eyes lowered, lips pressed tight. It had been planned. Every step, every conversation behind my back, every dinner I hadn't been invited to. This wasn't advice. It was a transition. A coup staged with smiles and handshakes. Charles stood beside Tyler like they were unveiling a new sports car. It's the natural next step, Brandon. You've been incredible with operations, scaling, efficiency. But Tyler's expertise is growth capital, IPO structuring, valuations. This is his arena. I couldn't speak. Not because I didn't have words, but because I knew none of them would matter. The writing was on the wall. They were pushing me out of the company I had rebuilt from ashes. And worse, they were doing it under the illusion of gratitude. Tyler smiled again, that same smug smile, and extended his hand across the table. And I shook it, because in that moment, I understood something clearly. This wasn't about business. It was personal. Strategic, yes, but calculated. Precise. A knife slid slowly between my ribs, disguised as a handshake. The evening was dressed in success. Linen napkins, champagne flutes, the glow of designer chandeliers, and the hum of polite laughter over a 10-course menu. We were seated at a private dining room overlooking the lake, a celebration arranged to honor the most profitable quarter Dorrington Industries had ever seen. 13 years of grinding work had brought us here, to this pinnacle, and I told myself that maybe, just maybe, this was a turning point. Maybe the tension with Whitney would ease. Maybe the company would finally settle into a rhythm where I didn't have to fight for every inch of progress. I wore my best suit, gave my best toast, shook the right hands. The air was thick with congratulations, but underneath it, something felt off. A strange silence behind the clinking glasses. Glances exchanged too quickly. Smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. Then Whitney stood up, glass in hand, her face lit with a confidence I hadn't seen in months. I expected her to toast the company, maybe even offer some pre-rehearsed appreciation. Instead, she cleared her throat, and with the same rehearsed calm she used when breaking up with old friends she'd outgrown, she looked straight at me and said, "Brandon and I have decided to go our separate ways." The room stilled. I watched forks pause in midair. My brain didn't even try to catch up. It simply froze, buffering like a system too overwhelmed to function. Then she continued, almost eagerly. "Tyler and I, we've reconnected. What started as a friendship became something more. We're engaged." She said it like it was some poetic inevitability, as a betrayal could be softened with the word love. And she didn't look at me with guilt or shame. She looked at me like I should understand, maybe even be happy for her. Across the table, Tyler sat with that familiar smugness, his hand now resting openly on the back of Whitney's chair, like a predator done with the chase. I looked at Charles, the man who once shook my hand at the altar and called me son. He didn't look away. In fact, he raised his glass. "To Tyler," he said, his voice full of manufactured pride, "the future CEO of Dorrington Industries." It was too choreographed to be spontaneous. Every seat at that table had been chosen, every word planned. 13 years of sweat, sacrifice, missed birthdays, and sleepless nights reduced to a severance package and a PR smile. They told me they'd taken the company as far as I could, and that Tyler's leadership would open new doors. Charles handed me an envelope, thick with paperwork. "We want you to leave with dignity, Brandon," he said, as if he were offering a favor instead of delivering a betrayal. "A generous severance, full pension, glowing recommendation. If you ever want to consult." I didn't speak. I didn't throw the wine in anyone's face or slam my fists on the table. I just looked around at the people I had thought were my family, the ones who had eaten my meals, toasted my success, lived under the shelter of what I built. I saw nothing but entitlement in their eyes, confidence that I would take this quietly, that I'd disappear with my money and make way for the new regime. So I smiled, not because I accepted it, not because I was at peace, but because I knew something they didn't. Because while they were busy planning their coup, they had forgotten one thing. They may have taken my title. They may have taken my marriage, my trust, my seat at the table. But they had no idea what I still control behind the scenes. They didn't see it in that moment, but they would. Very soon, I left the restaurant without a word, stepping into the cold night air with a kind of silence that always precedes something permanent. My breath fogged against the windshield as I slid into my car, but my mind was already elsewhere. There was no emotion, no rage, no heartbreak, no grief. Just focus, a cold, precise clarity that had eluded me for months. I wasn't interested in revenge for the sake of ego. What I wanted was balance, and they had tilted the scale far too long. It was time to correct it. When I got back to my office, I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need them. Every inch of this place was etched into memory. The photos on the wall, the framed first contracts, the printout of our first profitable quarter. None of it mattered now. What mattered was what I had built beneath the surface, in the shadows of their complacency. They had mistaken my long hours and obsessive attention to detail as desperation to please, when in truth I was insulating myself for the moment they revealed themselves. Over the years, while Charles played patriarch and Whitney played hostess, I built firewalls. I made sure the critical machinery updates, the proprietary process algorithms that cut production costs by 17%, were registered under my consulting firm, not the company's name. That firm, a small LLC quietly operating from a post office box and a separate domain, owned the rights to the software that kept our factories competitive. Dorrington licensed it, yes, but I own it outright. Termination of that license? One clause away. The patents that revolutionized our aerospace components? Filed under my name. Personally, I had learned early that Charles never read the fine print. Too proud to admit he didn't understand the technical language I used. Whitney had no interest in operations. She thought engineering was beneath her. They signed where I told them to sign. They smiled and nodded while I quietly attached every piece of our growth to my own legal identity. Then there were the clients. That was never about charm or corporate handshakes. It was about trust, years of showing up at midnight to fix their problems, flying across the country to handle emergencies myself, calling their engineers directly instead of sending junior managers. These weren't just business contacts. They were relationships. And every one of them had my personal number, not the company's. Mine, because they didn't work with Dorrington. They worked with me. So when I sat down that night and opened my laptop, I wasn't writing a resignation letter. I was drafting termination notices, licensing withdrawals, software locks, cease and desist letters regarding patent use. I had spent years building the engine, but I had installed the kill switch in silence. All I had to do was flip it. Tyler thought he had taken my company. Whitney thought she had replaced me. Charles thought he had outmaneuvered me. But they never understood the truth. I was the company. Without my systems, without my IP, without my network, Dorrington Industries was nothing more than a name on a building, a shell, a facade built on my back and tied to my hands. And they had just cut the very ropes that held it all together. I worked until the sky shifted from black to pale blue. By the time the sun rose, everything was already in motion, and none of them saw it coming, because they weren't playing the same game. They never were. The morning after I pulled the trigger, I began making calls, not to lawyers or PR firms, not to board members or financial advisors, but to the people who actually mattered, the ones who had kept Dorrington Industries alive long before the dinner knives came out. Our clients, the presidents of logistics firms, the aerospace engineers, the procurement heads of billion-dollar manufacturing chains, people whose trust one had earned not with handshakes and press releases, but with relentless commitment, answering their calls at midnight, personally fixing supply chain nightmares, helping their teams optimize parts that weren't even in our contract scope. I didn't have to sell them anything. I just told them the truth. I was starting something new, and I wanted them with me. There wasn't a pause. Not a single one asked for a brochure, a proposal, or even pricing. Most of them said the same thing. Tell us where to sign. Because they knew what I brought to the table, and more importantly, they knew who I was leaving behind. In less than a week, I had transferred the core of Dorrington's client base to McAllister Dynamics, my new venture, formed quietly months earlier, complete with infrastructure, staffing, and an airtight legal foundation. Every major account, every long-term contract with growth potential, followed me out the door like loyal soldiers walking behind their general. There was no negotiation, no hesitation, just clean, precise exits from Dorrington's ecosystem. Tyler tried to play damage control. I heard through contacts that he started calling clients directly, offering discounts so aggressive they bordered on desperation. He promised faster delivery, personalized support, dedicated account teams, every buzzword they could string together to make up for what they had lost. None of it worked, because you can't replace trust with spreadsheets. You can't manufacture loyalty after you've let the person who built it walk away. Then Charles stepped in, trying to leverage his old influence. He reached out to CEOs, leaned on favors, called in old debts. Some of them answered, out of courtesy more than obligation. But they all said the same thing. We're with Brandon. He even called me directly, his voice a mix of rage and desperation, and accused me of sabotage. This is extortion, he growled over the phone. You're dismantling your own family. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain myself. I just said, It's not extortion, Charles. It's business. You built a house on my foundation and thought you owned the land. I'm just taking what's mine. 2 days later, I filed the official revocation of Dorrington's license to use any of my patents, frameworks, or software. I knew exactly when the letters hit their inboxes. 10:03 a.m. At 10:07, Tyler called me. I didn't answer. By noon, half of Dorrington's manufacturing lines were inoperable. The systems they relied on to coordinate production, gone. The calibration protocols embedded in their machinery, disabled. The patents covering the core of our aerospace components, no longer theirs to touch. They had no legal ground to stand on. Every document was clean. Every agreement watertight. Every dependency surgically severed. Within 2 weeks, 73% of Dorrington's business had vanished. Orders were canceled. Partners walked. Supply chains collapsed. They tried to pivot, to outsource, to salvage what they could, but nothing moved. They were frozen in place, like a ship with severed rudder, drifting in circles until it finally sank. All the press statements in the world couldn't hide the truth. Dorrington wasn't innovating. It was bleeding out. And as for me, I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I watched from a distance as the company I had once built with my bare hands was reduced to the pile of arrogance and short-sighted greed it had become without me. They thought they had buried me, but all they did was plant a seed. I watched Dorrington Industries unravel the way a structure does when the final support beam gives way. Slow at first, then all at once. Within a month, the parking lots were half empty, production lines sat cold and still, and their name, once considered a growing force in industrial manufacturing, had become a whisper followed by silence. The press releases stopped. The panic spread to the lower levels first. Engineers, technicians, logistics managers, all scrambling to understand why their software no longer functioned, why long-time clients had gone dark, why vendors suddenly required upfront payments for orders that used to run on credit. Tyler tried to posture through it, making public statements about internal reorganization and strategy pivots. But behind the curtain, I knew the bleeding was uncontrollable. Charles hadn't been seen on the floor in weeks. I was told he had started avoiding the boardroom entirely, preferring instead to hide behind his secretary's closed door, taking calls with banks, probably trying to hold back the inevitable with whatever collateral he had left. And Whitney, well, by then her curated social media life had gone quiet. The moment the money pipeline dried up and the camera flashes stopped. So did her enthusiasm for playing First Lady of Industry. For people like her, loyalty only lasts as long as the luxury. I waited, quietly, patiently. I let the damage settle until the fire had consumed every inch of the structure they had tried to steal from me. Then, and only then, I made my final move. The offer was simple. $8 million in cash for everything that remained. The building, the machinery, the storage facilities, the furniture, and most importantly, the Dorrington name itself. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a lifeline tossed to a man already underwater. Charles didn't even counter. By the time my lawyer slid the paperwork across the table, he was a hollow version of himself, eyes sunken, suit rumpled, voice thin and dry. I almost didn't recognize him. Gone was the arrogance, the manufactured confidence, the air of superiority he had worn like armor for decades. All that remained was desperation and regret. He didn't speak much, just nodded once and signed. His hand shook as he wrote the name that used to mean something, used to be a legacy, a brand, a badge of honor passed down through generations. Now it was a transaction, an afterthought, a sale made not out of strategy, but out of surrender. When the deal closed, I walked the halls one last time. The factory floor echoed with emptiness. Dust had settled on machines that used to hum day and night under my command. Offices that once buzzed with planning and energy now sat abandoned, desks cleared, lights off. I stood in what used to be Charles's office, looked out over the quiet grounds, and felt nothing. Not joy, not satisfaction, just closure. Then I retired the Dorrington name. No press release, no commemorative plaque, no tribute. I had the signage removed by nightfall, the website taken offline within the hour. The name that once stood for a family legacy that had been built with grit and then nearly ruined by entitlement would exist no longer. I folded what little was salvageable into McAllister Dynamics, absorbed the usable assets, reassigned a few loyal employees worth keeping, and buried the rest in history. The circle was complete. They had handed me a crumbling company and underestimated what I would build from it. Then they tried to take it back. And I let them, for a moment, just long enough to burn every bridge they thought they could walk across. 70 years of legacy ended with a signature and a silence that still hasn't broken. In the months that followed the acquisition, silence became a luxury I hadn't realized I'd been craving for years. No board meetings poisoned by ulterior motives. No shallow praise from in-laws who resented their dependence on me. No fabricated smiles across candlelit galas, where I was nothing more than the workhorse behind someone else's throne. Tyler disappeared almost immediately after the collapse, like the coward he always was. Ran off to California, probably trying to attach himself to someone else's rising star, before anyone realized the Dorrington implosion had his fingerprints all over it. I never bothered to track where he landed. Men like him don't rebuild. They cling, then flee. Whitney, though, her fall was slower, more public. The friends she once paraded through our home stopped calling when the catering checks bounced. The invitations to high society events evaporated when her name lost its worth. The sponsors, the stylists, the photographers who once crowded around her at every event, gone. And when the designer bags had been pawned, when the last lease vehicle was repossessed, when the lights in whatever overpriced rental finally went dark, she came back. She showed up at my office, thinner than I remembered, wearing the same perfume she used to drown herself in before charity luncheons. She didn't knock. She didn't need to. My assistant recognized her and let her through, assuming incorrectly that I'd want to see her. She stood in front of my desk, her voice trembling under the weight of pride she was trying to swallow. She said the words I'd imagined hearing so many times. How sorry she was. How it had all been a mistake. How she didn't know what she was giving up until it was gone. She tried to make it sound like grief, like loss, like revelation. But it wasn't. It was desperation. The moment power was no longer on her side. She remembered what loyalty was supposed to feel like. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw her out. I let her finish every syllable, then leaned back in the chair she once tried to steal from under me and told her the truth. She hadn't betrayed me for love. She had chosen power. And power doesn't forgive betrayal. I told her I hoped she found peace, but she would never find it here. I didn't say it with bitterness. I said it with finality. Today, I run a $95 million private enterprise spread across 3 states. McAllister Dynamics now employs over 600 people, and we move more product with more precision than Dorrington ever dreamed. My name sits on a glass of every conference room, not because I chase prestige, but because I earned every inch of it. The custom-built home I live in isn't just a monument to success. It's a sanctuary. There are no in-laws, no curated guest lists, no ghosts from a legacy that was never mine to begin with. Just silence, integrity, and the satisfaction of building something real. They thought they owned the dream. They thought they could take it back. But the truth is, they were only ever living in the world I built for them. And once I took that world away, they had nothing left. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying someone. It's showing them they never mattered.